right, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming, and thank you to everybody online who's watching our presentation here. So today I'm proud to introduce Dr. Gregory Hum. He's here from the University of Toronto, and he'll be discussing redesigning course evaluations in rehab sciences at the University of Toronto with us over this hour presentation here. Just a little bit information and a little bio on Gregory. He holds a PhD in educational technology and learning design from Simon Fraser University, and an MA in educational psychology from McGill University. Gregory oversees the centralized course evaluation at the University of Toronto, and is working with the course evaluations team and others at the Center for Teaching Support and Innovation, and on the ongoing development, analysis, reporting, operation, and implementation of the framework and system. Gregory also provides support and guidance to administrators and faculty on the interpretation and use of course evaluations in practice and policy, as well as general educational development and support. So let's welcome Dr. Gregory Hum.
All right, thanks. Thanks for the introduction. Also, I want to give credit to Brendan Tam, who's my research assistant, who's helped find a lot of the literature and worked with us on this project for some time now. So I'll talk about a couple of things today. So the first thing is just an overview of the work that we do at the University of Toronto and the framework that we use. And then I'll talk about specifically the implementation process that we've been undergoing, specific to the Faculty of Medicine and in the rehab sciences in particular. And then I'll end with just talking about some overall keys to success that generally cut across all of our implementations. So in terms of our overview, so at the University of Toronto, course evaluations have been in focus for a number of years now. And the original question was about what defines good teaching. And so this challenge was identified early on, and there were a number of elements to this. So one of them is just that there were a number of different questionnaires used across the university. So there was really no centralized form. Some people have centralized forms. We did not at the University of Toronto. And so these forms represent a lot of different things. So they represent a lot of different priorities around teaching, a lot of ways that teaching was understood. The way that these forms were delivered were radically different. And they all had different perspectives on teaching. And so there's just a lot of heterogeneity across the space. One of the problems with that is that assessments really are meaningful for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that they communicate to the community at large what's valuable about teaching, how teaching should be done at the university. And so without any kind of core design, it became unclear whether or not these were effective in terms of communicating what the priorities were for any particular unit, but also across the university at large. So we really want to figure out how can we collect it in order to make sure that we collect information that's meaningful. So I'll just start with talking a bit about the University of Toronto. So the University of Toronto is very large. So we have the central St. George campus, but we also have the satellite campuses, one at Scarborough, one in Mississauga. And each of these are really university into themselves. The Faculty of Arts and Sciences within the University of Toronto is the size of or larger than many universities. So the scope of this project is really large, and we conduct evaluations across all three campuses. So we have the largest student body in Canada, large enough that it's a little bit hard to figure out the exact accurate number, but we have about 88,000 students, and then depending how you count it, could differ a little bit. We have a very diverse student body. Students come from a number of different countries. And as well, we have a large number of faculty, staff, and librarians. So there's just a lot of people involved, a lot of people that could be evaluated, a lot of different situations. We have a huge number of programs, and so this was really germane to this project, is just trying to figure out how can you accommodate this huge number of different programs, courses, all sorts of different graduate programs as well, professional programs. We just have this huge diversity across the university. So an assessment was done a number of years ago to just determine what the landscape was at the time. At the time, they identified at least 33 different instruments. Since then, I think a lot more have emerged. But basically, everyone's kind of doing their own thing. It wasn't always clear where these instruments were coming from. And it was and still is noted that these instruments are varying quality. Some are good, some are bad, most are somewhere in between. But generally, there wasn't really an attention to survey best practices. It wasn't clear where these instruments came from, who designed them, and why. So there were a lot of questions that were potentially problematic. And as well, there was really a lack of consistency across the university. So just because everyone had a different form, even if you wanted to, there was no way to look at trends across the university, to kind of look at different things that were happening. So there was a desire to kind of centralize it, partly so that we could look at the data and learn some things about the course evaluations and the teaching and learning context at the University of Toronto. And as well, underlying all of this, there was a review done by the Auditor General a number of years before this that looked at teaching across Ontario. And one of the recommendations was that course evaluations be brought to the fore and that they play a larger role in determining how to improve teaching and learning. So this was all brought into focus. So in the approach where everyone could do their own thing, a number of issues arose. But basically, one key thing is that we wanted, there was a tension where there was a desire to centralize things due to what I just mentioned, but also we wanted to be able to accommodate all the different teaching and learning contexts across the university, of which there are a great many. So the desire was to have both a centralized and decentralized model and try to fit both of these things, and to collect data for both summative and formative purposes. So by that I mean information that's used for high stakes decision making, like promotion and tenure, so that's summative, and then formative as well. There's really a focus on how this information can help support teaching and learning and improve an instructor's teaching. So this endeavor has a lot of people involved. Currently, this is being overseen by the Vice Provost Innovations in Undergraduate Education, who's Susan McCann. And we also have a course evaluation advisory group. And so this is important just because this is an institutionally supported system. So we have upper level administration that's involved, but also the advisory group has faculty members on it. And so they have a voice in how these evaluations are conducted, what our priorities are. And so a lot of this work that I'll talk about, this implementation, some decisions that were made in collaboration with these bodies. So the Course Evaluation Advisory Group will have faculty members. It has administrative representatives from faculties that we're already implemented in or are implementing in. So for instance, the Vice Dean in medical education sits on that advisory group. So in our day-to-day work, we facilitate faculty-led committees. So we go in, and obviously we're not subject matter experts in these areas or necessarily know everything about their context. So we work with them. We bring with us a knowledge of survey design, best practices, and evaluation, and we work with those committees to try to negotiate and create items that make sense of them. And I'll talk about how this framework works in a minute. But this is quite a large project, and you do need people to manage different elements of this. So there's myself, of course, and we've talked about that. There's as well a data analyst, so Tamara Rosner, who is our data analyst, and she does a lot of statistical work, and I'll talk about why that's important afterwards. But a core part of this is the ongoing validation work and study that we do of our own data. But it takes a lot of people to run the system itself. And so Tara Wells leads the operations, so that means taking in all the data, conducting all these evaluations, and I'll show you they're quite complex. And there are a number of course evaluation assistants and data coordinators and people that help centralize the efforts within our office to deal with the technical side of these evaluations, because it is quite a complex endeavor. And some of that leads into some things I'll talk about later. So why is this important? I think we need to recognize that generic instrument can never really serve all purposes particularly well. And in part, this is because every instrument embeds certain assumptions in them about what effective teaching learning is. And so when you look across instruments, they all have a slightly different operational definition of what effective teaching or learning looks like. So without matching it to your particular context, you're never really quite sure if it fits. And ideally, of course, you want it to fit closely with your goals. So to that end, that's why we have what we call the cascaded framework at U of T. So at the institutional level, so across the entire university, there are 8 standardized items that are applied regardless of discipline. So these were all agreed upon early on by the committee at the time. And these items are thought to represent the priorities for teaching and learning that could cut across the whole university. The form is capped at 20 items, and then we work with each of these lower levels to negotiate what the rest of the form looks like. So there'll be a number of items at a divisional level. So division is kind of a weird U of T term, which refers to whatever the next level of organization is. That could be a faculty. So for instance, Faculty of Arts and Science has within it all the departments like psychology, biology, whatever. But it can also refer to the like schools. So there's the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, which is basically a faculty of education. So they're their own division. But then confusingly, you get University of Toronto Scarborough and University of Toronto Mississauga are also divisions. That's just how it is. And then they have departments and faculties within themselves. So below that, we figure out what these other levels are, and we create items for each of these levels in collaboration with the relevant groups. So for instance, in arts and science, we'll have the institutional items, then they have about 3 divisional items, and then they'll have items for the faculty, items for the department, and then they may have items for specific course types like labs or whatever. And so that's how we accommodate all these different contexts while also being able to have this common element that we can look at. As well, to facilitate that formative part of evaluation, there's also a part of the form that's dedicated to so-called instructor items. So instructors at a certain point in the semester can then go into the set item bank and they can select items that they're interested in. And the intent of that is to make sure that instructors have this opportunity to ask questions that they may not want automatically communicated. So at the University of Toronto, the base policy is that all course evaluations go up to chairs and senior administrators. And so there are certain things that somebody may not want shared up. So for instance, if you're really concerned about your communication style or skills, you may want to ask those items in the formative items. So you select those items, only you will see those results. And so you can report them if you wish, but they're not automatically reported. So that's how we aim to serve that formative purpose. So for these specialized areas, what we do is we'll work with each of these levels. So for instance, at the divisional level, we work with them to develop these discipline-specific items. So in collaboration with them, we will look at what their teaching priorities are, learning priorities are, and then we'll think about items and craft with them items that are both sensitive to their context and fit their context, but also adhere to best practices in terms of survey design. And we also are beginning to work with divisions to start revisiting items, so looking at what the stats say and seeing if there are items that need modification. For instance, if there's no differentiation, everyone gets very low scores, everyone gets very high scores, then that may not be a useful item. So we're starting to do that kind of work as well. So technology is always a key component of how these things can be done. We use this evaluation system called Blue, which is a company based in Montreal, called Explorance. So Blue was selected in the RFP because it enables us to ask questions in this cascaded format. You can basically shunt you can populate the form with the items that are relevant to any particular student in any particular course. It also allows for that item bank I mentioned. So as you imagine, this is a really large project, and so it's been going on for a number of years. So we've been doing a phased implementation, and so a large proportion of our divisions are already on the system, and we're working with another section of divisions currently to bring them into the system, and so that's that whole process, which I'll talk about. And one of them is the Faculty of Medicine, and the order was not random as such. So they, prior to when I started, they started with what they consider to be the easiest divisions, which are primarily undergraduate, the very kind of general divisions that fit most things. And so those are things like arts and science, engineering was an early adopter as well. But now we're entering into these other units where I'll say the course evaluations are much more challenging to deliver, and designing them is much more challenging, and I'll talk about some of those issues. But clearly, I think there are some commonalities there: dentistry, medicine, pharmacy, OAZ, so education. They're all professional-oriented programs. Many of them are in the health sciences as well. We know that Alana has a lot of these situations where the courses are just very different than what our system generally evaluates. So I'll talk about some of the challenges that have come up. So the implementation process, again, is guided by senior leadership and the course evaluation advisory group. And so they, in collaboration with us, make these decisions. But when we work with units, or when I work with units, our main focus and the focus of the operations team is both to make sure the evaluations make sense, but also to do a full technical assessment. And that's really key to making this work, is to look at their data and making sure it's clean and that it can be entered into our system and deliver the evaluation in a sensible way. And that does present some challenges. So in terms of design, when I work with committees, there's a number of pieces of advice I give, and I'll just give some examples of those. But when I work with them, I try to make sure that I provide them with the resources, the relevant literature around how they could think about their teaching priorities, how to create items, and in particular, I really work with them to try to avoid questions that are known to be problematic. There's certain types of items that are known to be biasing. For instance, items on the instructor's knowledge or the so-called overall items. So we try to make sure that whatever they craft adheres with best practices in survey design. Also remind them about the purposes of feedback. Again, the evaluations aren't just this kind of rote activity, and although this is how things often fall, people just kind of forget about them and they just kind of keep happening for some reason. They do and should anyway serve certain key purposes, and it helps to keep those in mind when designing items. So there's of course those formative purposes. Instructors should be able to take this and say, this is what I need to do with my course. This is how I should improve my course. This is what students like or don't like, or this is what seems to facilitate learning. This is what doesn't. It can also be helpful for internal program improvement. All programs have certain goals, and you want to make sure that those goals are being achieved and try to figure out how the program can serve those purposes. But of course, in the end, course evaluations are heavily used for summative purposes. And so to just think ahead about some kinds of data or information that you would want for things like the teaching portfolio, which is used for promotion tenure at U of T, presentations to the faculty council, so how you want to talk about teaching learning within your unit to the rest of the university, your annual report, and then to other bodies like for accreditation and things like that. There's certain types of information or certain information that obviously is important to that program, and so you want to make sure you ask those on the evaluation. And we try to make sure that people think closely about whether the items make sense. And this is kind of a key thing. A lot of evaluations ask questions that aren't always relevant to everything. And we want to make sure that that's not what's happening. So to think about, when instructing, what all instructors actually should do in that block of courses where the questions are being asked, what all students should be learning or experiencing, because ultimately that's what this is supposed to be for. It's supposed to be for the students. And a particular issue is just whether that question applies to all the courses that it's being applied to, right? So certain types of questions are not really appropriate for things like a lab course, for instance, or asking questions about the assignments are obviously not relevant if there are no assignments in the course, which sometimes happens. So you want to really closely think about, does this actually apply? Another situation where that happens, and I'll talk about one of those, is questions about kind of aspirational goals, like things like encouraging diversity or equity. Is that something that is explicitly done in every course? And at the core of all this is whether this is something that students can actually judge. And that's a fairness question, and if this is being used for summative purposes, that's really important. So that's just some of the advice generally that we give and how we facilitate this process. So I'll talk about where we currently are in the medicine implementation and where we've gotten so far and some of the challenges that have come up. So University of Toronto Medicine is very vast, and that's kind of an understatement. It officially, according to the faculty roles on paper, the University of Toronto, I think, has more faculty members than the rest of the university put together, and that's because everybody in the teaching hospitals and all of the University Health Network, they're all in there, so there's a lot of people. University of Toronto Medicine is vast geographically. There are teaching hospitals associated with U of T and Barrie. And even just in the campus itself, the health sciences buildings are all over the place. The faculties are really large, as I just said. And there are three basic pillars to this faculty. So there's undergraduate medicine, which is the general clinician training programs, the majority of people becoming MDs. There's the postgraduate programs, people doing fellowships, medical doctors who are coming back for professional development, things like that. And then there's the graduate life sciences education unit. And that encompasses a lot of those other things too, but also has a lot of the graduate programs, like PhD programs and things like that. So we are working specifically with graduate life sciences education right now, and these were considered to be in the so-called rehab cluster during the earlier implementation. So these are occupational science and occupational therapy, genetic counseling, physical therapy, and speech-language pathology. These four formed that original cluster. And we ended up working with all of them, and I'll talk about that in a second. But as you can see, there's a lot involved. There's a huge number of units just within GLSE alone. So the first thing we did was we started with initial consultations with the Graduate Life Sciences Vice Dean of Education office. And we did a literature review just to look at evaluation in medicine. So it became immediately apparent, of course, I mean, just from speaking with people, but also from literature, that health sciences has a number of teaching situations that I wouldn't say are unique to the health sciences, but certainly more prevalent, and they weren't things that we necessarily covered with the existing questions. So there's a lot of hands-on and lab learning, much more so than a lot of existing things in the implementation. There's often a need to evaluate individual units, so like, you know, particular lectures or units. These things might overlap in unusual ways. They might be really short. And these are not, generally the system evaluates a course, right? And so that's not currently, so that's not what the system generally was set up to evaluate. There are also a number of other things like there's a lot of course, clinical teaching. And these are a small number of people. The whole format of teaching and the way the teaching is understood is very different. And there's often courses where there's a coordinator and there's multiple lecturers. And so there's a lot of different roles in the class. And so people are all doing different things. So the evaluation can't necessarily ask the same thing of all of these people. So early on, we identified as a really major challenge was the course format. So these multiple lectures, modules, short courses, clinical courses, these are all quickly identified as an issue. Like, it wasn't clear how we would evaluate it and how technically speaking this would work. And this remains a challenge. So our initial faculty-wide effort, we were initially tasked with working with the Faculty of Medicine. So they all, those three pillars got together and they all talked about items for the Faculty of Medicine. They had a number of meetings and then they basically agreed to disagree for the time being. They said they couldn't, they would defer this decision. They did, however, decide to take the institutional items, so we had that. But the decision there was made to just work with GLSE, and specifically actually to pilot with the rehab sciences because they were interested, and so we would start with that cluster. So we did start with them. So those 4 units were the first. But soon after, the decision was made to then basically start creating items for all of just the individual units, so all 13 units. So we did actually create items in the majority of cases, not all. But I'll talk about some of the challenges that came up. So we did work closely in the early on with genetic counseling, physiotherapy, OSOT, and PT, SLP. And there were really productive meetings. I think people really valued the opportunity to talk about these questions, about, questions about how does accreditation link with your goals in the classroom. People really were really engaged with this conversation. And a set of initial questions were drafted, but although we drafted those initial set of questions, slowly over time, I think each of those units decided that actually maybe those questions don't fit us that well. So one of the things that came out was this question about equity. So there was a question that came up with that, this course, something along the lines of this course promotes diversity and equity or an understanding of it. But some of the programs said, well, that's not really an explicit thing we do. This is just, we deal with this as a medical problem. So this is not, this kind of wider understanding might apply to the other rehab sciences, but not ours. Their definition of equity differed. The degree to which this could be addressed in the classroom differed. So it became clear that it would be very difficult to come up with cluster level items. So it ended up being at the unit level only. And also everyone just has their own set kind of accreditation and goals for their students. Some people had more professionals, some people had less, so it became really tricky. But we did create items, and I think one thing came out of it was that we started developing more items for professional practice and professional competency. So here's some examples. So the course provided an opportunity to develop genetic counseling practice-based competencies, so it's really linked around their specific competencies that they had identified. Students are aware of what those competencies are, and so they ask that question. Enhance my understanding of professional occupational therapy practice, so specific to the actual practical component. They were really interested in how this supports professional practice. And then for speech-language pathology, they really want to link the theory with what happened in the course, and this was a really explicit goal for them, so they asked that question. So this really sparked those conversations about what teaching should look like in a particular unit and then how to evaluate it. So I think some things that came out of this was really having engaged key points of contact to lead these bottom-up efforts, to have these conversations was really essential. So like I said, items were created in the majority of cases, but not all. I mean, there were people who basically disappeared on us or didn't really have that much interest in it, they didn't have enough meetings, and so some people had a meeting a week and they created items really quickly, and they were really engaged, and other people basically lost track of the project. So really having someone leading this initiative and really driving this forward is really critically important. And these conversations are really important. I think some people, for instance, in pharmacy, they brought in a lot of people. They had really wide-scale consultation, and they had a lot of really important conversations around how this met their 5-year plan, how this met their accreditation requirements and things like that. And there were a lot of people involved in those discussions. So it could be really productive, not just for improving the course evaluations, but for talking about the program and how it approaches education in general. But one thing is, it is hard to find common points of evaluation, or it can be, if they're not just given to you. So that's the thing, when you have a standardized instrument, it's just there and everyone sort of has to deal with it. But if people have the option, then it becomes trickier. And maybe that's not necessarily a problem. But it does help to have some common core, and we did already have the institutional items, so that was already covered. So we didn't really need to have these other levels of consensus. So, again, like I said, one of the problems was, of course, how do you deal with complex courses? So we designed the items, and then we said, well, how can we actually implement it in these different things, like these lecture courses or whatever? And at the same time that we were doing this, the operations team quickly identified that the data that was underlying a lot of these courses didn't really represent what was happening in the course, and this made it even more challenging. So not only was there was a course coordinator and then 20 lecturers, but the data only listed that course coordinator as the instructor. Who these other people were, we had no idea. So that's a major problem. Then we discovered what we call shadow systems, where basically people would put something in the registration system just to block it in so students would get credit. But it turned out registration was something totally different. This happened with module courses. So people would just register someone for module 1, but actually module 1 could be 20 different short courses. And so we knew that this was a challenge, but the decision was made to move forward with the pilot anyway with whatever courses fit. So, and that basically meant courses with fewer than 5 lectures. You might be able to guess how that went. Coverage was very low. So in the end, what happened was when we actually did this, we were able to evaluate less than 10% of the courses. Physiotherapy, nobly, had no courses that fit the framework. All of their courses had more than that, or they were evaluated at a different level. So we couldn't even put it in. So we had the questions crafted, but there was really no way to deliver this in a sensible way. And due to that, a lot of units did start to opt out of the pilot. So we're still in the pilot, so we're trying to sort out the options. But one thing that came up was that this would require them to run 2 systems at once, and I don't think anybody wanted to do that. So there were a lot of people that left. So that's basically where we're at currently. So I would say, though, that I think one of the things we learned was there were a lot of cases, maybe even the majority of cases, where people were actually really interested in coming into the system because the person doing the evaluations was often administrative staff member, and it was often a lot of work, actually, and they had to manually type in everything, do everything, and there was really nobody helping them. So a lot of them were really eager to come into the system. But sometimes so resistance often came from somewhere else. I think most people that just kind of work with the data were more than willing to hand this off. But that said, there are cases where they can create a lot of new work because we rely on the system, the core system data. It's not just the survey system where you type in stuff. Some people don't know how to use that system, so it actually create new work for them. They have to retrain, and so sometimes people didn't like that. I would say that obviously a limited pilot is inherently limited. We knew that going into this, so without kind of a comprehensive plan about how this would fit into the technology and things like that, I think it was clear that we would not be able to implement in all of the courses. So that was a challenge that was already there. So I mean, obviously it would be ideal to have this all in place in the first place. And that's basically where we're at now. Because those constraints, those technical constraints really do constrain what you can do in the actual evaluation. And I think an underlying thing that came up, not infrequently, was that we were just simply bringing up something that people just had not thought about or didn't want to think about. And they said, our form is fine, I don't know why you're coming in here. So that's why people were often very protective of, they would say like, the existing form is fine, it's great, we've had it for ages, it's amazing. That person would say that, but then other people would say that actually is not true. But I think there were a lot of people that really attached to their form, they really liked certain questions or something. And so it's just something to be aware of, and that's why whoever it is that's spearheading the initiative within that particular unit is really essential, because they need to convince people, they need to get that buy-in, and convince people that there is a need to do this. And I think part of the resistance was sometimes we did uncover issues. There were departures from established policy. There were some units that never shared evaluations with anybody, and that's not supposed to happen. Some of the forums were actually not that good, and I think people were worried about bringing that up, about what the issues around the questions were. And every now and then we found situations, I don't know in particular where, so I'm not sure if they happen in medicine, but this is something that does come up. People intentionally enter things into the system, like they'll put in someone as an instructor, but actually the instructor is somebody else, and that's a labor issue. But they did this for a range of kind of administrative purposes. So sometimes you find out things like that. So that's the thing, that coming in and implementing a system like this sometimes stirs up these issues that people hadn't thought about or kind of laid dormant for a very long time. So where are we going now? Well, we're now we've gotten permission to increase flexibility of the system. We're really locked into this 5 instructor thing. So now we're opening it up, so we're trying to figure out how we can do that. So we're looking for ways to facilitate the data entry. So we're looking at systems where people could type in what the data are into kind of a constrained format, so that there isn't that kind of weird variability in the quality of the data, because sometimes people weren't typing things in exactly the way that the sheet would read it, and that would be a problem. So we could avoid those kind of syntax errors. But we're also looking for parallel systems. So I think the central system can do certain things very well, but there are all these other situations where, for instance, you want to just evaluate a lecturer that came in for 2 classes. That might not be appropriate for the central system, because we port everything in, we also archive everything. You might not need that much feedback, so it might be helpful to have another system. We're looking at parallel survey systems that we could offload some of that additional complexity into the division. And some of those are already happening. So sometimes some people are already doing it, like they evaluate lectures with paper only or something like that. So we're looking at those, but I think key to that is now we're coming in an advisory role for those other systems and providing that same advice around best practice for those other situations as well. So we're looking at ways that we can evaluate individual teaching events. So if this particular module or this particular unit, so that's not something we've been doing before, but now we're looking at ways we chunk this up into smaller pieces or overlapping pieces as needed to get the information required. One thing that we've looked at also is to try to create a shorter version of the form. So one thing that came up was that in the faculty of dentistry, for instance, students are taking, I forget the exact number, but it's a large number of courses. I think it's like 15 all at once, and each of those can have like 10 instructors. So students were filling out 50, 60 evaluations on a regular basis. I think that's clearly a problem, because the form is about, I think for dentistry, about 17 questions or something. That's a lot of questions, and you have to start to doubt people's ability to accurately answer that many questions. So we're looking at creating these shorter forms for that. So that flexibility is really important, and just allowing students maybe not to answer for all lectures. If they don't remember someone, they shouldn't be forced to respond something to this person. And the other thing we're working on doing is finding a local liaison within the Faculty of Medicine to help us centralize the tasks and needs assessments, to really start gathering existing forms and all that. As a central office, as you saw, we're working with a lot of people at once, so we have there's really basically just me and Tara, and then to some extent the research assistant, who can do this stuff. So, and we're a large university, so having someone there that can just focus on medicine and collect all the existing forms and figure out what's happening, and provide more focused attention and provide that insider's perspective on some of these issues. Like I said, there's all these hidden kind of issues that come up, will be really helpful. So that's basically where we're at right now. So I just want to talk briefly about some of the overall keys to success generally with the course evaluation system. So I will say that we have gotten a lot of increased buy-in. Early on, there was a lot of resistance to the system. When the system first started, a lot of people said, well, why are you doing this? Why are you coming in? We don't want this. And like I said, there were some people in medicine that were like that. But actually, for the most part, actually, people have heard about the system now. They're really interested in coming in. And that's a large part due to all these other things we do. And so, like I said, it's really important to have this consultative implementation process, which I've described. But also, I think we also aim to engage all the users and stakeholders in the course evaluations to make sure that this is used in a valid way. And this means a number of things, but basically we really closely communicate with people through a number of means just to make sure that the evaluations are understood and they're used appropriately. So we do a lot of things around making sure students are engaged with the evaluation. So we send email reminders, there are posters around campus. We've worked with the university communications office to create articles about course evaluations where faculty talk about them. The learning management system sends reminders, so we have integration with the technical office. And they set up these pop-ups and things like that. And also within medicine in particular, and dentistry I know does this, they have student representatives like class presidents talk to the students about why these are important. And it is that why it's important that's really critical and to think about. We've done post-evaluation surveys and students identify as the number one factor as to why they would fill in the evaluations is that basically it makes a difference, right? That the course evaluations do something, that this information is used, it doesn't just go into the void. And that's what ups response. And in the health sciences, this has been noted as well. Just giving students some knowledge about how these results have been used, how they will be used, is just really critical for students to see the value in this and actually filling out the instrument. Also important is just drawing from the evidence to support the credibility of the system. I think a lot of course evaluation systems basically have nothing underlying it. And it's not clear where this comes from and what the evidence for it is. And so we really work to make sure that that's the case. And key to that is being clear about what the strengths and limitations of course evaluations are. They aren't the be-all and end-all, and we never say that it is. And it really helps then to have an understanding of the literature, but also to have looked at local data. I think people really value evidence from a local level. There are a number of theoretical reasons for it, but I think simply just be able to say, like, this is data from our university, so you might think this one thing, but look at the data and see what it says, right? So for instance, I think people typically are really worried about the adequacy of response rates, but we've shown that actually response rates are actually quite good across the university. People are worried about like how they might be penalized, for instance, about the timing of the evaluation, things like that, and we can show that it doesn't really make any difference. So all these things are really helpful. So we always explain to people what course evaluations can and cannot tell us. I think it's important to keep in mind that course evaluations are a key mechanism by which students' voices are heard. If you remove that, that means students basically have no say, and there really is no situation where that seems to make sense. But they are a self-report, and the literature only really supports, I would argue, that it only supports students being able to self-report what happened in the class, what strategies were employed, and how they perceived it, whether the course, from their perspective, had a lot of work or not. And that's important because there are a lot of misuses of course evaluations. And it's important to keep in mind that the misuse doesn't completely invalidate them as an exercise, but these things do happen, they should be confronted. I think this is where a lot of the worry about course evaluations comes from. They hear where the chair does something weird with the evaluations, and so people are really worried about them. So one thing is that we always tell people course evaluations are not intended to be a full measure of teaching effectiveness. Students are not evaluating the instructor, they're reporting their experience. The evaluation comes from a combination of the course evaluations with other evidence. And there are a number of things in item design that we make sure that people don't ask or try to avoid it. We know students can't assess, again, the pedagogy of the instructor, but also their absolute realized learning outcomes. People aren't able to accurately assess how much they've learned. And there's certain attributes like instructor knowledge that students are not well placed to evaluate because they are not subject matter experts, and there's really no way to know how much someone knows by looking at them. So we always emphasize that course evaluation data shouldn't be the only source of data. So it is just one piece of the whole picture. At the University of Toronto, the teaching portfolio is required for promotion, and it incorporates all of this evidence. Course evals are just one piece, and that's the policy. So whenever there are issues with that, people are over-relying on course evaluations. I always point people at the policy. This is the official policy of the university, is that you do not exclusively weight the course evaluations. So they're a great tool. They can do great things, but they do what they do, right? They aren't the be-all and end-all. So to that end, we provide resources. So we did a focused statistical study of our course evaluations to look at the validity, and so that included making sure it all factor analyzed together, looking at the reliability of scores, what correlated to those scores, things like that. So that's there, and that's a really strong piece of evidence that's really helped Buyin. And also have translated that into key recommendations for academic administrators. So how do you properly use these evaluations? Basically how not to abuse the evaluations. And people really value that as well. So I'll give some quick examples. So one of them is this core question of like, what is a low score? What should the scores look like? Well, we present the scores as they are. You see the scores are actually all skewed to 3 and 5, from 3 to 5. So people are often really concerned about their scores if there's like 3.9 or something like that, but we show that actually that's pretty typical, and by definition, half the scores are below average anyway. So the vast majority of people actually have scores that are fine, and that's something that should be communicated. And context is really important. Just looking at the scores alone don't mean that much. So we always point out as well that people like having this, so it is reported, but we always remind people that these small differences don't mean anything, and generally you shouldn't be comparing your course to the faculty's ratings or anything, because they're comparing to similar teaching situations, which may have different scores just by virtue of what they are. So course size is one of the big ones. As well, response rate differs. So we make clear what a good and bad response rate is. So we provide all this information so that people can say, like, this evaluation actually had a really low response rate. This is less trustworthy than this other one that had a good response rate for the class size. And class size really is a big factor in all of this. So we found that evaluation scores do reliably go down on average as the class size increases. And so this is a really key piece of information to keep in mind. If you are, as you should not be doing, but as some people do, if you're just sorting the scores in Excel, to some extent you're just sorting people by class size. So that's not a meaningful thing to do. So just to review, again, I think the overall keys of success really are having this consultative, involved, and responsive implementation process so that people can sit down and have the opportunity to have those discussions that are really useful and important and productive to design evaluations that really fit particular contexts and decide what areas of commonality could exist. But also to engage people in those course evaluations, to make sure that the uses of those evaluations are informed and valid, make sense, and that everyone's engaged in them, right? The students see the purpose of them so that they fill them out, that instructors see the purpose of them so they encourage students to fill them out, and also that they read them and can interpret this information to improve their teaching, and that administrators should know how to use these things appropriately, right? They shouldn't be sorting in Excel, should be using all this other information. It's the abuses of course evaluations that really cause a lot of problems. And in order to help inform that, it really helps to look at the evidence and to be able to provide that evidence-based perspective and resources so that people can use these evaluations in the best way possible. And so that's it. Thanks. So does anyone have any questions?
You said that scores typically go down with increasing class size. Is that just because people are less satisfied when they're in a big class versus when they get more attention in a small class, or are there other factors that are at play there?
So we're not really sure from our own data, but I think the literature generally suggests that larger classes are just less positive learning environments in general, and I think that has a little to do with what the class looks like, right? I mean, if you're in a class of 200 people, there isn't a lot of individual instruction, there isn't a lot of opportunity to ask questions. The types of assignments will tend to be kind of more generic and things like that. So I think it's just the type of instruction that large classes have, I think, are generally just different and less satisfactory learning situations. That said, there is complexity to it. I think there's been some suggestion, and some of the data and some of the vision suggest this might be true, that there's a bit of a kind of like a UE, like really small classes have better ratings, and then it kind of starts dropping off. But there's a suspicion that really large classes, and I think some people found this, extremely large classes actually have better ratings. And And that's partly because people know what to expect coming into it. If you're going to take this huge, 800-person course, that's what it is, and that's what you expected, and that's what you wanted. So I'll just say the relationship is complex, and that's why it's important to look at your own data, because you need to figure out what that looks like in your context.
I wasn't at the workshop this morning, so I apologize if this is repeat. So my understanding is that all the course evaluations at U of T are not done during class time then?
So they can be filled out outside of class time, but we did develop a protocol. So that's one of the communication strategies. So we provide PowerPoint slides that instructors can slot in, and they provide a protocol for filling it out in class. So before the class where they fill it out, you tell people to bring your laptop or bring your phone or whatever. And then in the class where it happens, I'll be out of the room for 20 minutes. I'll give you the opportunity to fill it out. So that's an option as well.
How often do you think that's done? What's the...
It's hard to tell. It was a much requested thing. Like, a lot of people have asked for that, so there's no way to tell. but the people who do it have really valued it. So.
Are you still hopeful that you might get some common questions between some of these groups, or do you think that maybe what you'll come up with is some questions that might work for tutorial sessions and other ones that might work for lab sessions?
Yeah, I think one of the things is probably the latter, that like looking within the rehab sciences, right? Like, they're all the rehab sciences and they all kind of certain common things. But the reality is that that's just kind of a label, right? The same way they're in GLSE. Like, I think any commonality has to be organic, and so you need to kind of cluster things by what is actually similar, not, kind of force these people to try to find out what's similar.
What's the word? The program that you use, I forget what it was called. Blue. So is there a huge cost associated with that to the university?
I'd say the cost is a relative thing. As far as enterprise software goes, it is relatively cheap. So I've been told. I'm not really involved in that end of it, but I've been told that it's relatively cheap. But it is enterprise software, so those things are always, it's not even like us buying, Microsoft Windows or whatever.
When you were showing the ratings from U of T, they use a 5-point scale, so there's some sort of neutral response option, is that right?
No. So it's a quantity scale. So it's like it's like the quantity scale would be like mostly or somewhat, things like that. So it's a continuum. There's no neutral response in that one.
In terms of your experience and your best practice, how much diversity in terms of response is optimal? We use a 4-point scale that's sort of agree, disagree.
Right. I think most of the broad evidence suggests that there is variability that's detectable all the way up until about 5. And then beyond that, some people suggest the 7 is pretty good, and then it drops off again. 4 is definitely on the low end, because it becomes there are very few options, and it's also a forced choice, right, in many cases. I would say 5 or 7 are probably ideal. Yeah, I'd say 5 is adequate. I think at a certain point it's just hard. I think it's just hard for people to make any kind of distinction. So. All right.
So thank you, Dr. Gregory Hum, for your time and your presentation and great information. So thank you.